Welcome to Digestible Academia, a BlueSky Thinking podcast where we break down complex academic research into something a bit more digestible. In this episode, we were joined by Patrick Vestner, an expert in age diversity and digital collaboration at the University of Cologne.
If you tuned into our previous episode, you'll know that we explored how different generations collaborate, particularly in digital environments. However, when we spoke to Patrick, he raised an important question. Is talking about generations the right approach at all?
Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today on Digestible Academia. It's so great to have you as a guest. I was just wondering if you could just tell us a bit about your research and your background, just to get us started.
Sure. I'm glad to be here, so thanks for the invitation. I do research at the intersection of age diversity and digital technology, so really looking at this potentially conflict of a lot of people being old and not able to use technology in an efficient way. So that's something that really triggered my interest before starting my PhD. And I'm in hopefully the last year of my PhD, so hopefully wrap it up soon. And my studies mainly look at field experiments and field studies, so working with organization on that topic. How can a younger and older employees being employed and managed in an efficient, healthy way, not only in the light of digital technology, but mainly in regards to the second mega trend of digital technology that intensifies our workplaces more and more.
Thank you so much. So as we know, the world of work has never been more diverse than it is at the moment, particularly when it comes to age. We have baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z all occupying the workplace at the same time. Each of those different generations has their own perspectives, experiences, preferences, and values. So what would you say are the challenges that employers are commonly facing when it comes to uniting such a spread demographic?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's true. Workforce are getting older. We start earlier. We work longer. I think around like 30% of the Western workforce is going to be retired within the next 5 to 7 years. So we do face quite a challenge, a demographic challenge. And before we dive into the more challenges for employers part, I want to quickly divert into, okay, we need to understand where generational thinking is coming from, right? So there are two main theories, the generational cohort theory and the social identity theory, that originates from the 50s and 70s. So they explain mainly difference between people that are born at different times and how do people identify as being part of one group or not being part of one group. And I basically lay this quick foundation because it's an important instrument of us understanding and appreciating differences based on when people were born, right? Why I'm saying this is also the very same instruments are also hindering us basically to move forward, in my point of view. So basically, us understanding there are differences is good to appreciate, but also understanding there are differences often leads to biases, stereotypes, and so on that makes communication, etc., very difficult. And so they have supported us understanding it, and they were also hindering us in the sense of from an organizational perspective, organizational behaviors perspective. And I personally think thinking in generations is problematic, and that's for different reasons. So it's a very good topic to have conversations, and I know that the public press is very keen, and there are a lot of consultants out there, including myself sometimes, basically making good money with those concepts. But actually, first and foremost, it can have dangerous implications for the leadership of organizations because it is a limited individual performance due to fear of conforming to stereotypes, also self-stereotyping. So, for example, older, younger people basically kind of hold themselves back because they don't want to take a project on because that's rather for younger, right? For young colleagues, because it's more technical or whatsoever. Or age discrimination in development decisions. No promotions, recruitment is a field where a lot of discrimination happens in regards to age. And like to wrap it up, there are poorer interactions, more conflicts between colleagues of different ages, because we kind of categorize between us and them. Okay. So those points, so only a few points why I think it's difficult or dangerous at least to talk about generations, even if it's a well-intended. There are definitely unintended consequences in that regards. Yeah, so I don't know, shall I divert a little bit into why generations are also very difficult to measure and compare, and why most of the research that I know basically says there are no such thing like generations. Shall I divert into that? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
If you please just ask questions or raise anything, or if you're not agreeing with what I'm saying, please just raise it.
No, please declare your expertise with us.
Okay,
I
perfect. So
I think
yeah.
it's interesting to raise this discussion because, we want, on our previous podcast that was on the same topic, we looked a lot at those sort of those generational breakdowns and those sort of challenges, and what you raised a second ago about stereotyping and how that can then come into play, and people then perhaps holding themselves back because they feel that maybe a certain forum or a certain project isn't for them. So actually taking it from the perspective that those ideas of generations perhaps shouldn't matter as much or shouldn't be sort of defined as much, I think is an interesting one. So yeah, please do tell us more.
Okay. Well, very lovely. So as I said, like on one hand, we have those tools. They simplify our, let's say, contact management with others. Like we know older people have more physical impairments that come with age, for example. So that's like a universal truth, right? And as I said, there's the same tools, they lead to stereotyping, exclusion, like baby boomers struggle more with technology, or Gen X are less happy to change at the workplace, or Gen Z are lazy. I mean, you name it, right? I mean, we hear them all the time. And we tend to ignore with that generational perspective or lens, or that's at least how I follow this discourse, is that age diversity, and that's basically true for all kind of diversity, has or can have substantial benefits for organization, right? I mean, I can dive into that a little bit later, but the second reason why generations are very difficult to talk about in a scientific sense is because there's no clear definition of what baby boomers, Gen Z, etc. are. So if you Google, for example, these terms, you will find very fluffy because there are different definitions of when does it start, when does it end. And as a scientist, everything that is not clearly defined is also very hard to measure, to analyze, etc. And that's why it is difficult to have clear answers on that. And Martin Schröder, like 1.5 years ago, he published something very interesting, meta-analysis that was very interesting, because he kind of tried to depict the generational effects, right? So he looked at things like, for example, need for security and safety. That's the classical thing, how we have a discussion about different generations, right? And empirically, he's pretty clear. He said there's no generational differences. And this superb meta-analysis, in my point of view, explains it very well, because he basically says there are two different things to play into this discussion. So traditionally, the statement that generation means that you can explain people's attitude by year of birth, right? So when am I born, regardless of how old I am at the moment, because that will be an age effect and not a generational effect. So if we talk about generations, it's rather my date of birth. And you also forget to include the period that this question is asked. So basically, when do you ask it? Because that would not be a generational effect when I ask someone, that would be a period effect.
Yeah.
And those two, like having those three, let's say, concepts in mind, it's basically, if you take them into considerations, and if you like control for age and for period, there's almost no generation left. Does it make sense? So why this generation actually consists of different concepts that need to be understood. So what he actually did then at the end, he looked at all those, on a first sight, significant differences, like the one I mentioned before. Control for looked at period and age, and at the end of the day, in this respect, there was no generations left. So you can explain people's attitude by the year of birth, as you can, sorry, and I rephrased that one. Okay, so you can explain people's attitude by their age, right? And you can explain people's attitude by when they were interviewed, but you can't explain it by generations. And what is interesting, and other colleagues like Hannes Zacher or David Costanzo, like among the best researchers in that field, they published 2020, they published a interesting, and I think for practitioner very well written paper called, I think, Generations and Generation Differences, debunking the myth in organizational science and practice. And they completely confirm basically what he said. So I think that's very important if we talk about it. And I don't want to kind of rip your question apart. Don't get me wrong, but I think it is very important that organizations often talk about generations, whereas like it's very hard actually to argue anything with the concept of generations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating perspective, particularly in the media where, people are defined by which generation they're in rather than their actual age. So to completely shift that perspective is so, so interesting when it comes to a topic like this. Do you agree, Kerry?
I do. I do. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. There are a huge number of factors in individual people's lives that might influence how they see the world, what they like, how they specialize, how they choose to work, who they engage with. There's the old saying that age is just a number, and it sounds very cliche, but it's true, and it depends how you apply yourself and the environment that you're in, as much as what you do and how you do it. But unfortunately, the world kind of sees it the other way. And, you do get these enduring stereotypes, like you mentioned, Gen Z and Gen X and what they like and how they typically work. And that does transfer into the workplace as well. And you mentioned earlier, sort of those stereotypes can hold employees back from certain things. And you said as well, there are areas where sort of communications and challenges exist. So I wondered sort of what your work does in terms of sort of exploring the solutions or offering sort of alternative ways forward as a means of overcoming some of those challenges.
I completely agree with what you say. There are different ways for organizations, let's say, to tackle this, and I think we know that from the diversity literature in general, not specifically age diversity, right? So it's a lot of reducing biases, for example, reducing stereotypes, improving a common sense of similarity as well. Also diverting basically factors that we kind of accounted to age to different individualistic difference. Because Carrie, you just said it very, very nicely. We are kind of a portfolio of different characteristics, and age is just one of it. And is also this research on intersectionality, right? So where you basically have different characteristics that a young woman, for example, has a complete different experience than a young man in certain things, not in all kind. And despite looking at age, or if we only look at age in that sense, that would really lack of any substance in that. Because, for example, if an older colleague with tech experience, for example, is a complete different person than an older colleague without tech experience. So in regards to tech or in regards to other things, that intersectionality is so important. So coming back to your questions, Gary, is like, what did we do? We actually we designed a intervention study that we run with a bigger German financial institute, and we tried, or what we know from research is that like naturally employees don't see the benefits. So they don't see the complementary strength, for example, that old and youngers bring to the table. We tend, and that's going back to this social identity and social categorization from the very beginning, we tend, and that's a heuristic that makes perfectly sense because it makes our life a little bit easier to say, okay, I see a young woman, hence I think this person is XY. That makes perfectly sense because we are living in a complex world and this heuristics helps us. However, that also leads to that people don't really see the benefits, or they're not aware about, okay, what does a older colleague, for example, bring to this project, or what skills, what experience, and so on. So what we tried to do is in that experiment is basically we wanted to help organizations to benefit from that rich, in our sense, age diverse portfolio of strength, right? So one solution can be to raise the awareness through training. That would be a very classical approach, very formal, right? You have a program, you have an online course, whatever it then is, but raising this awareness is like a first step. And second step, in my point of view, is basically using that formal learning or different formal learning formats to trigger informal learning at the workplace. And I think that's one thing that we tried to look at, and the results were positive in the sense of we did not only find it can have a positive effect, but non-significant, unless my colleague, and in our experiment, it was an age diverse colleague, so at least 10 years, I think on average 22 years age difference between the two. If this person or this colleague has a positive attitude towards technology in our case, then informal learning behaviors were triggered. So, for example, technology exploration, try and error with new tools, or using existing tools in different way, but also mutual learning in the sense, okay, I give information, I receive information, and we learn from each other. So that kind of using formal training to trigger and foster informal learning can be a way forward. And as I said, what we basically found out is that it has a very big impact on how my colleagues, or maybe network of colleagues, is thinking about the topic that we are talking about.
Yeah, I can understand that. I can see how that was sort of helping sort of easing those communication barriers as well. You're getting people to learn informally and learn from each other. Then you're sort of naturally at the same time sort of eroding those barriers that stop them thinking that they can't talk or they can't communicate effectively because they're doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you think that informal learning's more effective than the formal learning through the courses? When it comes
You're asking me if that's more effective. Did I understand you right, Chloe?
just in your opinion.
I think it's not a substitute. I think you need one thing for the other. And what do I mean by that is, and then again, we come to differences that are age-based, right? Younger people learn differently than older people. That's just a matter of fact. So, for example, we know from research that younger people have more growth orientation, whereas really advance career, learn according to the advancement of the career, if you want. So, whereas like older colleagues tend to be more emotionally driven. So basically aiming to have meaningful connections. And that means not that older learn less than younger. It just means they learn differently. So coming back to your question, because I know we only have 40 minutes. So coming back to your questions, I think you need both, because even though that older workers love this self-directedness, being in charge of my learning path and so on, it's also important the organization have a little bit something to say in what you develop, actually, right? And that's, for example, this facilitation of your path. That's, in my point of view, the responsibility of the organization. Whereas, like, using your own agency and moving forward and develop and grow, that's the responsibility of the individual. And that's more likely to happen, especially for older employees with informal learning techniques. Whereas like the first one, the organization responsibility is probably easier to use formal learning formats.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that makes complete sense. Thank you. So, over the past few years, obviously, as you know, there's been a huge shift to working from home, and many of us are working hybrid or working from home completely. However, this past year or the past few months, even, there's been a huge shift to going back into the office. Lots of companies have, begun to enforce return to office mandates. They cite reasons such as better collaboration, more productivity. So what do you think about this? Do you think we are better going back to the office? Does that help, generate more collaboration between colleagues or not? What do you think?
Chloe, that's a very interesting question. And I follow this debate with huge interest because some of my colleagues are doing research on this as well. And I think both sides, and again, it's not a simple answer to that, right?
Sure.
So to make this conversation a little bit complicated, it's really about both sides. So big companies bringing back their workforce, I see their point why they're doing it. And also research are emphasizing why employees want to work from home. And I think my fast answer would probably be the truth is somewhere in the middle. So, in order to balance the different needs of the organization as a system, but also the employees, I personally think a hybrid model is probably the best design. Now, what does hybrid model means? For some, that means, oh, we can have this call, but we can also have a face-to-face meeting. For other means, 4 day at home, 1 day in the office, or 3, 2, whatever. So that's really need to be defined by every organization. So I personally think that's probably the best mode because it also fulfills the individual needs that we have for motivation, for example, right? And then again, a little bit leaning onto what I try to explain with formal and informal learning and the organizational responsibility and individual responsibility. We also have the organizational needs and the individual needs. And I personally think it's not very clever to force back your people back into the office because that's solely the organizational need, right?
Mhm.
And let's be clear, such measures like they are instruments to lay off people, to cut down costs. I mean, why else would you, without any strategic guidance, basically take into consideration that 15 to 20%, and that happened in some organizations, 15 to 20% resigning after like being forced back into the office. I don't think it's strategically very sensible to hope that the right people kind of resign after such a measure, because we also know that those that find alternatives easily usually are the best people. So you kind of risk to be stuck with the leftovers. And I'm sorry for saying leftovers for people, but you know what I mean in that sense. So putting very shortly, putting a more scientific perspective on it, during COVID, we had conflicting data. You probably remember that when some studies basically said, "Oh, it's really good. People are um, are more productive at home, working remote than they are in the office." So actually, this force is very good. And then there was like a second wave of studies basically saying, "Oh, hold on, they're not that productive, and we kind of are less efficient." And I think what is very interesting is if you look how they were measured, the studies, they're different. So the first wave often was measured on individual level, right? So for me, for example, being able to concentrate more, being more productive in the sense of output and other measures, not only productivity, versus in the second wave where we actually looked more on a team level. And they basically also realized, okay, hold on, I might be then and might be more productive individually, but that comes with the costs on a team level. And to be perfectly honest, I think that really sums it up what the dilemma is, right? Because on one hand, you can't say it's good because you like to send people back to work because you lose the autonomy of people. That is a really important need that need to be fulfilled for motivation. And on the other hand, you kind of say, okay, it's bad because you no, hold on. So again, so you can't say it's good or bad, right? Because you compromise on one thing or the other. I think that's to finish up here. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, certainly we've seen that those hybrid models letting employees find the ways that work for them, or using those in-person opportunities to really focus on the things that need to be done face to face, so that then people have the space to work remotely on the other projects. Bringing people in just for the sake of it, like you said earlier, doesn't really seem to accomplish a lot, and seems to be driving a fair amount of resentment as well. And obviously, as we've seen, particularly during COVID, there's a huge amount of tools now in play that we've not had in previous years that can help when people are spread geographically to bring them together. So I know that some of your work sort of deals with tech as well. So I wondered if you had any sort of advice or any sort of tips, I suppose, for how companies or how teams can sort of drive that collaboration and sort of drive that forward using any sort of tech tools or things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert on the tools, on the different tools. So I would probably answer this in the sense of, regardless of age,
Yeah.
there are different needs, as we already established, right? And in terms of communication, for example, or communication styles, we do know that, and that depends a little bit if we want to stay a little bit generational. That depends a little bit how you socialize, with which tools and so on. So it is very likely that people who grow up with more chat kind of communication skills, channels like Slack or WhatsApp or whatsoever, use that maybe with more ease than someone who is used to email, right? So this different exposure to digital technology throughout life, that basically makes maybe younger people preferring that kind of instruments and tools and so on.
Mhm.
But then again, despite the communication styles that might be different or likely to be different, I wouldn't say, at least I don't know at the moment. I didn't find anything in preparation of this conversation. Didn't find any good quality studies basically telling me youngers prefer, I don't know, social media within organization communication, and older prefer emails. There are different lenses that can be put on this, but then again, as soon as experience come in, age on technology has no effect anymore.
Mm.
So because we often talk about the great digital divide, right? And that's the best generational conflict conversation is about technology. Uh, but we also know from research, and I mean, there are not only studies, but also meta-analysis have depicted it, that actually, as soon as experience come in, age doesn't have any effect anymore. And that's a good thing to know, right? On a very high level, that's a good thing to know, because you can basically increase the experience with the tools. So coming back to your questions, the communication styles are likely to be different, but we can't say older prefer that and younger prefer that. That's just too much simplification in that sense.
Yeah. So our last question for you is
Sure.
quite a big question. So how do you envision the workplace shifting in the future? What do employers need to be aware of? And what would you say are the best ways for leaders to navigate these changes? A very big question to end with, but
Yeah, that should be the first question, I guess.
like, Asia.
Yeah, makes sense. I've been thinking about this question in preparation of this conversation, and I think what would be nice if leaders help us being a little bit less simplistic about things, and kind of start to differentiate in their leadership. And what do I mean by that is, the world has become complex, we know that, and it will further become even more complex. And we can't give simple answers to questions that are actually pretty complex. And when I said before, age is just one characteristic, I mean, that's such a fine balance between fulfilling that age-related needs, not generational age-related, while not overemphasizing age differences, but also taking other contextual factors like team maturity, personal life of followers, organizational structural restraints into account. And that is challenging. That is very challenging. I do appreciate that. And that basically brings us to the bottom of this, is really balancing individual differences and team cohesion or group cohesion. And to finding that balance, there are good instruments out there, from the leadership literature, like individual consideration or accommodative and developmental HR practices. Psychological safety is something we heard a lot about in the past years. And of all these instruments, finding that creating a bouquet of flower, we say in German, of different instruments, that's the difficult part. And because more and more things need to be considered, and once someone found his or her bouquet of leadership, let's call leadership instruments, it is likely that it needs adaptation pretty soon. So such a bouquet is always moving. And I think that's also a different part, right? So first I need to really consider a lot of things that are polarized without ends. And second of all, it's never moving. That makes it so difficult. Still, I hope that the leaders of tomorrow move away from simplifying things, and we see it up to the top level in global politics, but also in head of multinational companies who simplify at the moment very much. So we do expect much more digitalization, much more polarization, and I'm also kind of excited about those things because if you have kind of conflicts and that's also room for improvement, room for movement, because if it doesn't hurt sometimes, we as a society don't change. But that's like, it's a grand question. So I really, yeah, that's probably my answer to what I really wish for leaders of tomorrow.
I really like that sentiment to end on. If things aren't sort of difficult or painful to get through, then you can't find progress. So yeah, you've got to find some challenge in order to overcome it, and I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, Patrick. I think we've all learned something. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me and having the patience of all the detours of answers that you allow. Appreciate that.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's been fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise there. Yeah, the details were all very, very interesting, so don't worry too much about that. If you enjoyed this episode, please do share, like, and subscribe for more. Our next episode will be about women and the future of diversity in the workplace, so make sure you tune in.